They tried to make her the scapegoat. Then her unpaid care became the evidence. At 7:18 in the morning, after 9 straight hours on her feet, Tanya Whitaker stood in a bright conference room with a patient bag beside a disciplinary paper. Marjorie Lyle slid the paper closer and said the missing gown could cost Tanya 2 weeks of hours. Tanya kept her face still. She was tired down to the bone. But she knew better than to give fear a voice in a room like that. The gown looked small there on the table, almost plain. But the paper next to it felt heavy enough to change everything. Tanya had a child to get through the week, rent due Friday. Still, she did not shrink. She did not rush to beg. She just stood there, composed and quiet, while Marjorie treated her like a department problem instead of a person. Marjorie did not even bother to use Tanya's name. She called her Laundry, smooth as ever, and said the hospital needed accountability, not excuses. Tanya heard the insult in that one word. Elliot Granger stood near the door and watched. Saying nothing, Tanya lifted her chin and corrected Marjorie with her name. Plain and steady, she did not raise her voice. She did not plead. That small correction was all she had, but she gave it anyway. Tanya stayed standing. Then Marjorie said the write-up could affect Tanya's schedule. That was when the real fear came in. Not for the paper, for home. Tanya's mind went straight to Miles. To school breakfast, to the bus he caught in the mornings. To the rent waiting on Friday like a second clock ticking in the dark. She could lose a little dignity and still keep going. She could not lose hours and keep pretending nothing had changed. That was the part nobody in that room seemed to understand. They were looking at a form. Tanya was looking at a child's routine. A kitchen with not enough in it, and a week that could go wrong fast. Hours earlier, the night had begun the way most of her nights did. With overloaded carts and too little staff and too much to carry. Tanya moved through the rehabilitation hospital in clean scrubs that already felt warm by midnight. Nurses needed fresh linens. Patients needed beds made up. The work kept coming whether the floor was calm or not. Tanya kept checking names as she moved, reading tags, straightening stacks, making sure things went where they belonged. Nobody thanked her for that part. They only noticed if something went missing. But while the carts rolled and the hall lights buzzed overhead, Tanya was the one keeping order in a place that ran on her hands. On one of those rounds, Ruth Allison looked up from her chair and asked about her blue gown with the soft collar. Her voice was slow, careful, a little thin from the stroke that had changed the shape of her words. A rushed aide waved it off like it was nothing. Just laundry, just fabric, just one more thing to move along. But Tanya stopped. She said Ruth's name back to her. She repeated the promise Ruth had made about the gown. And in that small moment, the gown stopped being a stray item and became what it really was to Ruth, part of who she still was. Tanya treated it that way, even if nobody else did. Caleb Price caught Tanya near Ruth's doorway and lowered his voice. He said Ruth had been asking about that gown for 2 days. Then he rubbed a hand over his tired face and said he could not chase every misplaced thing on the floor. There were medications to check, call lights going off, 2 admissions waiting, and not enough nurses for the rooms already full. He thanked Tanya for looking when she could. He meant it. Tanya could hear that. But thanks did not give her time back. Thanks did not protect her if Marjorie asked why her carts were late. So Tanya nodded once and did not shame him for what he was afraid to carry. She only understood more clearly than before that Ruth's gown was going to be her responsibility alone. So Tanya kept going. She checked mislabeled bags. She read faded tags by the laundry light. She saved a loose receipt she could have thrown away if she had wanted to move faster. Then, when she finally found the blue gown in a reject bin, she took a scrap of paper and wrote Ruth Ellison's name in clear block letters. She tucked that scrap beside the torn sleeve so the gown would not be lost again. It was a small act, done in private, with no witness but the fluorescent lights and the hiss of the machines. But it was careful, exact, the kind of care that says a person still matters, even when the system has already given up on her things. On her break, Tanya sat in a narrow corner of the laundry room with the gown across her lap. She threaded a needle from the small kit she kept in her tote and worked the torn seam closed, stitch by careful stitch. The vending machine hummed beside her. Her coffee went cold, her phone lit up twice, One message was from Miles, asking if she had seen the note he needed for his morning notebook. Tanya stared at it for a second, feeling the pull of home in her chest. Then smoothed Ruth's collar flat. The gown could not go back rough and unsafe. Not after Ruth had asked for it by name. So Tanya gave up the only quiet minutes she had, making another woman's garment whole while her own morning slipped farther out of reach. When Tanya returned to the carts, Marjorie was waiting by the laundry room door. Her smile did not warm her face. She glanced at the clock, then at Tanya's hands and called her hun like the word was soft enough to hide the warning inside it. Personal side projects, Marjorie said, were not part of laundry's job. Tanya felt the repaired gown inside the patient bag folded and labeled, and knew any full explanation would only open another door for trouble. She said she was finishing the cart, nothing more. Marjorie looked at her a moment longer, as if silence itself could be entered into a file. Tanya pushed the cart forward, keeping the bag close, already feeling how care could be made to look like disobedience. Now, in the conference room, Marjorie's version sat clean and official on the table. Ruth's family had called, she said. The gown was reported missing. Tanya had been the last person seen handling items from that cart. Elliot Granger stood near the doorway, quiet in his dark jacket, his eyes moving from Marjorie's paper to Tanya's face. Tanya did not reach for the pen. She could feel the trap in every option. If she explained too much, she would be admitting she had done work nobody had approved. If she stayed quiet, the paper would make her silence look like guilt. Marjorie waited with one hand near the signature line. Tanya kept her fingers still and said she would not sign something that was not true. Tanya reached for the patient bag beside the folder. The room went still as she opened it. She lifted out the blue gown and laid it on the table with the repaired seam facing up. Ruth Ellison's full name was written on the label in Tanya's careful hand. The soft collar had been smoothed flat. The rip had been closed well enough for Ruth to wear it again. Tanya said she found it in the reject bin. She said it had been damaged. She said Ruth had asked for it, and it was not missing anymore. The paper on the table had called Tanya careless. The gown said something else. It said she had looked after what everyone else had already let go. Marjorie did not apologize. She adjusted the corner of the report and changed the shape of the accusation. The issue, she said, was process. Tanya should have reported the gown instead of taking matters into her own hands. The words landed smooth and hard. Elliot said nothing, but his gaze stayed on the label, then on the stitching along the seam. Tanya felt the old heat of humiliation rise in her throat and swallowed it down. She would not apologize for keeping Ruth's gown from the trash. She also would not give Marjorie an angry sound to use against her. So she stood there, quiet and tired, while the proof of her care was turned into another reason to question her. The meeting ended the way bad meetings do, with no clean finish at all. Marjorie said the discipline was pending review, which meant Tanya still had nothing solid to hold onto except the truth she had already shown. She took the patient bag with the mended gown tucked inside and stepped back into the hallway, where the air felt cooler and less cruel than the room behind her. Her phone buzzed. Miles had asked if she was coming to school pickup. That message hit harder than the paper ever could. She tucked the bag under her arm and kept moving, tired and shaken but still standing straight, while Elliot remained in the conference room looking down at the report as if it had stopped making sense. By the time Tanya reached Miles's school, she was late and still dressed from work. Miles stood near the front doors with his backpack hanging off one shoulder, trying not to look worried. Tanya kissed the top of his head and told him traffic had been slow, because that much was true enough. At home, she opened a small grocery bag on the kitchen counter and counted what could become dinner and what had to stretch into breakfast. Eggs, bread, one bruised apple, a half bag of rice. The review stayed locked behind her teeth while Miles talked about a spelling quiz. She listened, stirred the pan, and made her voice gentle. The hospital had followed her into the apartment through money and time and fear. But Tanya still set a plate in front of her son like the evening could hold. Denise came by with foil containers from church, and the smell of fried chicken and cabbage came with her. Warm and familiar. For a minute the kitchen felt less tight. She talked like she was trying to lift the mood, asking Miles about school and telling Tanya she looked worn out. which was true enough. But then Denise admitted she might not be able to get Miles to school in the morning after all. A home health call might come in. She said it gently, like a warning wrapped in love, but Tanya heard the real thing underneath it. Help was there only as long as it stayed convenient. Tanya thanked her for the food and took the containers to the fridge without making her mother feel worse. Still, the truth settled in her stomach. She could not count on anybody but herself. By the time Tanya got back out into the evening, she was already tired again. The bus ride to the hospital felt longer than it should have, and every stop along the way seemed to take a little more of her patience with it. She had a packed uniform in her tote, Miles's school notebook, and a rent reminder blinking on her phone that she did not want to open twice. She had forgotten to sign the notebook before she left, and that small mistake sat on top of all the rest. Tanya stared out the window while the city slipped by in streaks of light and brake noise, thinking about how one late payment, one late pickup, one bad mark at work could all start pulling at the same thread. She arrived with no cushion left in her day. Marjorie had already changed the schedule by the time Tanya got in. Her weekend hours were marked tentative, which was a neat little way of saying they could disappear if she gave the wrong look or the wrong answer. Then Marjorie used that same polished voice and called her laundry in front of 2 other staff members, as if Tanya's name were too small to bother with. She reminded everyone that side tasks slowed the department, and Tanya knew exactly who she meant. The room stayed quiet. Nobody stepped in. Tanya straightened her back, kept her eyes on the board, and said nothing that would give Marjorie a reason to take more. The humiliation burned, but she swallowed it down and kept moving. Because those hours were not just hours. They were groceries, bus fare, and a roof over Miles's head. A patient bag came down the line with 2 names crossed out on the tag and a little photo slipping loose from the seam. The posted chart said to send anything unclear to whatever bin matched the newest mark, which was exactly the kind of rule that made people lose things. Tanya held the bag in both hands and looked at the photo for a second longer than she had time for. It was somebody's brother, maybe, or a grandson, smiling in a ball cap. The official answer would have been easy. Follow the chart. Keep the line moving. Tanya did not do that. She took the time to figure out who the bag belonged to. Because if she let the paper decide, somebody in that hospital would go without the one small thing that made them feel like themselves. Tanya moved through the laundry room with the photo in her palm and began piecing the story together the way she always did. One little thing at a time. She checked the washer logs. She looked at the faded wristband stickers stuck to the back of the bags. She matched a room number to a move that had happened 2 days earlier. Then another move after that. The answer finally settled in place. The photo belonged with a patient who had been shifted around more than once that week. Tanya set the bag aside carefully and took a breath. There was nothing fancy about what she was doing. No one would call it skill if they did not already want to understand. But it was skill, it was memory, it was attention. And in that building, those things were carrying more than people realized. Tanya carried the patient bag upstairs and found the right room after 2 moves and 1 crossed-out tag. She returned the loose photo to the bedside table, placing it where the patient could see it without reaching. On her way back down the hall, she passed Ruth Allison. Ruth was sitting up in the blue gown, the soft collar resting neatly against her neck. For one quiet second, Tanya let herself be glad. Then Ruth touched her hair with a thin hand and asked if anyone had found her little comb. Caleb stood near the medication cart and looked over when Ruth said it. Tanya heard the warning in her own tired body. One more item. One more promise. One more reason for Marjorie to say she was doing too much. Still, she bent close enough for Ruth not to have to strain and asked what the comb looked like. Later, Caleb caught Tanya by the supply room and told her to be careful. Marjorie was watching her, he said, and that alone could turn any extra kindness into a problem. Then he added something quieter, almost like he was embarrassed to say it out loud. Half the floor came to Tanya when something went missing, because she was the only one who seemed to remember where anything belonged. He said it like a compliment, but it landed like a warning too. Tanya looked at him for a moment and did not let herself soften all the way. She knew what he meant. People relied on her. People also left her alone when it counted. She accepted the truth of both things without pretending they balanced each other out. Then she turned back to her work, carrying that familiar ache of being needed and unprotected at the same time. Behind the detergent boxes, in the corner cabinet with the stiff lock, Tanya kept the order nobody had asked her to build. Folded slips of paper, spare labels, notes about room changes, a loose button wrapped in tape with a name on it, a torn hem she had repaired before a family visit. Small things waiting until she could match them back to the right person. It had not happened all at once. It had started with one misplaced bag. Then another. Then a patient crying because a picture was gone. Then Ruth asking for a gown everybody else had stopped looking for. Month by month, Tanya had made a quiet system inside the broken one. It was careful. It was unpaid. It was not allowed. And if Marjorie opened that cabinet, the very proof of Tanya's care could be turned into evidence against her. The message came before the shift was over. All found patient items were to be turned in through the front desk by end of shift. No private storage, no informal handling. Any deviation would affect the pending review. Tanya stood in the laundry room with her phone in her hand and read the words twice. They sounded clean, almost reasonable, if a person did not know what happened to things once they were dropped into the wrong bin. A scarf could lose its name there. A photo could travel 3 floors away from the person who needed it. A comb could become trash. Tanya looked toward the locked cabinet and felt the choice settle heavy in her chest. Obeying might protect her for a day. It would not protect Ruth. It would not protect the next patient whose belongings got swallowed by a process that looked orderly only from a desk. Before dawn, the apartment was quiet except for the refrigerator clicking on, and the soft drag of Tanya's pen across Miles's school notebook. She signed the page she had forgotten the night before, then counted out bus fare and set it under a magnet on the stove. Miles shuffled in half awake, rubbing one eye, and asked if everything was okay. Tanya smiled gently, the kind of smile that did not tell the whole truth. She said she would handle what needed handling. Then, after he went back to his room, she took the small cabinet key from her pocket and tucked it deep inside her work shoe. Not because she wanted trouble. Not because she thought she could afford it. Because somewhere in that hospital there would be another name. Another item, another person who needed somebody to remember. Tanya tied the shoe and sat still for one breath before the morning took her again. The next school morning began with Miles's voice breaking into panic. His permission slip was not in the folder Tanya had labeled the night before. He stood at the table with his backpack open, papers spread around him, his face tight with the fear of being the child who forgot. Denise moved through the kitchen saying she had only tried to straighten things up. Tanya wanted to snap, but she saw Miles watching both of them. So she lowered her hands, took a breath, and searched without blame. The slip was tucked inside the wrong notebook, folded between 2 spelling pages. Tanya smoothed it flat, signed the bottom again to be safe, and handed it to Miles like nothing in the world had been ruined. She thanked Denise for trying. She kissed Miles's forehead. Tanya reached the bus stop just in time to see the backlights pulling away. For a moment she stood there under the gray morning sky, too tired even to curse. The next bus would make her late. And late was something Marjorie could use against her. She paid it anyway. By the time she clocked in, the money was already gone from the week in her head. On the schedule board, her weekend hours were still marked tentative. Beside them sat the same neat note about pending review. No one looking at her would know she had just bought her own way into being judged on time. She put her bag away, fixed her face, and went to work. Ruth was sitting near the window when Tanya came through the hall. Her hands folded over the blanket, like she was holding herself in place. She asked about the little comb again, the one with the pearl handle. The words came slowly. She said it had been wrapped in a green scarf. A floor aide passing by gave a soft laugh and said Ruth had been mixing things up all week. Like kindness meant making the truth smaller. Tanya stopped with one hand on the laundry cart. She knew what it sounded like when people made dismissal gentle. She looked Ruth in the eye and repeated it back to her. Pearl-handled comb, green scarf. Not because Tanya had time. Because Ruth deserved to hear her own memory treated as real. In the laundry room, Tanya waited until the machines covered the sound of the cabinet lock. She opened the door just wide enough and searched through the folded slips by date and floor. Her fingers found the older note near the back, creased from being handled more than once. Ruth Ellison, green scarf, pearl comb. Bedside drawer before room move. Tanya stared at the handwriting under the hard fluorescent light. There was not confusion, not fussing, not an old woman asking for things that had never existed. A record, a clear one. Tanya did not smile. Relief would have been too simple. The note could help Ruth, but using it meant letting part of the hidden system breathe where Marjorie might see it. She folded the slip back along its crease and held it in her palm, feeling how small proof could be and how dangerous. Tanya found Caleb near the nurse's station and showed him only the copied line, folded small between her fingers. Ruth Ellison, green scarf, pearl comb. Bedside drawer before room move. She did not mention the cabinet. She did not open the door to everything she had been keeping. She asked if Ruth's old room could still have a drawer nobody checked. Caleb read the note once, then again. His face changed just enough for Tanya to see that he believed the detail mattered. But then he looked down the hall toward Marjorie's office and lowered his voice. Checking old rooms would raise questions. Tanya kept her answer plain. Ruth was asking because she remembered. Caleb held the paper a moment longer, caught between what he knew and what he was willing to risk. Marjorie found them before Caleb decided anything. She came up with her tablet tucked against her side and that clean, patient look she used when she wanted correction to sound reasonable. Then she looked at Tanya's cart and added an extra count for the shift, since time had been lost on comfort errands. The words were quiet enough for the hallway, but sharp enough for anyone nearby to understand. Caleb stood there with his mouth closed. Tanya felt the shame of being corrected in public, then the colder sting of being alone in it. She nodded once, not because Marjorie was right, but because rent did not leave room for pride to speak first. The extra carts came heavy and damp, their wheels pulling sideways over the laundry room floor. Then her phone lit up with Denise's name, and Miles's voice came through small and worried. Tanya pressed the phone between her ear and shoulder while sorting sheets by size, trying to keep her hands moving and her voice soft. She called Mrs. Alvarez from the next building and asked if Miles could wait with her for a little while. She told Miles exactly where to stand, who to look for, and that he had done nothing wrong. By the time she hung up, the cart was still half full, Marjorie's warning was still in the air, and Tanya had less of herself left than she had started with. Near the end of the shift, Tanya finished the attic count. The last cart was logged, the last stack squared off, the last bin pushed where it belonged. She could have left then. If she moved quickly, she might still catch the cheaper bus and get to Miles before worry hardened in the silence. Instead, naming that scarf like it was tied to the last clear place she remembered, Tanya turned away from the exit. It was also everything she had left. She spent it on the promise nobody had given her permission to keep. The old room had already been cleaned for someone else. The drawer looked bare when Tanya pulled it open, but something green showed in the narrow space behind it. She eased the drawer out inch by inch and reached carefully into the gap. The scarf came loose in a soft wrinkle of fabric, dusty along one edge. Caught inside the fold was a tiny comb with a pearl handle. Just like Ruth had said, a crooked name tag still clung to the cloth. Ruth Ellison. Tanya stood there alone with the scarf in her hands, feeling truth arrive without comfort. Ruth had not been confused. Tanya had been right to look, or punish Tanya, depending on who got to name it first. Tanya brought the green scarf and the little comb back to Ruth with both hands, the way she would have carried something breakable. Ruth looked at them for a long moment before touching the comb with one finger. Her mouth worked slowly around the words, but the words came. She said it had been in the bottom drawer of the old bedside table. She said they moved her on a Tuesday after breakfast, when the sun was on the wrong side of the room. Caleb stood near the door with the official belongings sheet in his hand, and neither the scarf nor the comb was written there. Not one line, not one mark. Tanya did not say, "I told you." She only folded the scarf across Ruth's lap and let Ruth hold the comb herself. For that small minute, Ruth was not confused. She was remembered. Caleb exhaled through his nose and said, almost under his breath. He offered to put a short note where the floor staff could see it. It was not much, but for a moment it was more than Tanya had been given before. Then Marjorie appeared at the edge of the hall. Then to Tanya. Patient belongings, she said, could not be tracked through personal notebooks and hallway conversations. Tanya felt Ruth shrink a little under the words, as if remembering correctly had become another inconvenience. So Tanya kept her voice level and said the comb had been found and returned. She would not let Ruth be made foolish for telling the truth. Caleb's small support stayed in the air, real but fragile, while Marjorie took back the room by deciding which truth counted. By the time Tanya left the hospital, the cheaper bus was already gone. She stood under the stoplight with her tote pulled close and felt the day drag through her legs. The next ride got her across town too late, and Miles was waiting with his backpack hugged to his chest, trying not to look scared. Tanya apologized before he could ask. She just took his hand and walked him home. Inside the apartment, his school notebook sat in the tote beside a folded notice from the office. Repeated pickup changes. Please contact the teacher. The words were polite, but Tanya felt them land like another file being started somewhere. She slipped Ruth's note deeper into her bag and made Miles a sandwich, carrying one woman's restored dignity and her own child's worry in the same tired body. At the kitchen table, Tanya read the school notice again while Miles picked at the crust of his sandwich. The paper asked for a meeting if the pickup changes continued. It did not know about night shifts, missed buses. It only knew that Miles had been waiting in different places too many times. Tanya signed the bottom where the teacher had marked it and wrote a short note in the smallest, neatest hand she could manage. Miles asked if he was in trouble. Tanya looked up right away. No, baby, she said. You are not in trouble. She folded the paper into his folder and touched the edge until it lay flat. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep, but she made her voice steady enough for him to trust. At the next shift, Marjorie was waiting before Tanya had even tied her apron. She held a folder against her chest and smiled without warmth. The pending review, she said, now included unauthorized tracking of patient belongings. As if they were a loose thread she could pull whenever she chose. Tanya felt rent move through her mind first, then Miles's school notice. Then the empty space one missing shift would leave in the grocery money. She kept her face still. She said Ruth's belongings had been returned because Ruth remembered where they were and because the sheet was incomplete. She could not afford to sound proud, but she also would not stand there and call care a mistake. Caleb found Tanya later by the linen shelves, his voice low enough to be covered by the machines. He said 2 more patients had asked about things that were not on their forms. A watch, a prayer card. Small things, he said, then stopped because he heard how that sounded. Tanya looked at him until he corrected himself. He had not written any of it down. Marjorie would ask why he was taking Laundry's word over the paperwork. And Caleb had already learned what happened when a person got marked as difficult. Tanya did not ask him to be brave for her. The sentence sat between them. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck and looked toward the hall. He knew more than he had admitted. Tanya knew it too. Knowing did not protect anybody unless someone was willing to carry it where it could be heard. Near the bottom of a linen cart, Tanya found a sealed envelope tucked between folded towels. The name on the front belonged to a man who had been discharged the day before. A front desk clerk had mentioned his family calling twice. Looking for papers they said never made it home. Marjorie's rule was clear. Found items went to the general bin. Tanya looked at the envelope, then at the bin, then at the hallway leading to the front desk. The safe choice would have taken 5 seconds. The right one took longer. She walked the envelope herself, asked the clerk's name, and watched it get logged before she let go. No speech, no complaint. Just the patient's name, the return time, and her own signature on the slip. Then she went back to the carts with her heart beating too hard for such a quiet act. The front desk clerk took the signed slip from Tanya and glanced at the folder beside it. The family had already called the linen vendor's office, she said. Like that settled everything. Tanya did not ask who Elliot was. She did not need another name attached to her day. She just turned back toward the carts and kept moving. Tired hands on metal rails, her mind still on the next load. She did not know that her careful return, done to protect a patient's family, had just left a trace strong enough for someone outside the hospital to find. It was only a slip of paper. Still, paper can travel farther than gossip. Farther than status, farther than the room that tried to own her work? Before the weekly summary went upstairs, Marjorie sat in her office with the small incident list open on the screen. The returned envelope was there, neat and inconvenient, with Tanya Whitaker's name beside it. Marjorie smoothed the corner of a printed page. Her voice made the choice sound practical, efficient, clean. A few keystrokes later, the envelope was gone from the summary. The family would get their papers. The hospital would look orderly. Tanya's part would vanish. Marjorie leaned back as if she had settled something. But the copy for Elliot's review was already outside her reach. This time Tanya's name was still on another copy. Marjorie called Tanya into a side office that smelled like old coffee and printer heat. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She said Tanya had a habit of knowing too much about patient belongings, and that it was making staff uncomfortable. Then she told her to stop writing patient names anywhere outside the assigned tags. Tanya stood with her hands at her sides and listened to the request dressed up as professionalism. It was a neat little trick, turning care into attitude. Tanya looked at her and asked the only question that mattered. If names could not be kept clear, how are people supposed to get their things back? Marjorie's face stayed smooth, but her eyes went flat. Tanya could feel the shift. This was no longer about one envelope. It was about whether a black woman's memory would be treated as useful or dangerous. Instead, she turned to Caleb, who had been standing just inside the doorway like he wished he could disappear into the wall. She asked him whether Tanya's notes had caused confusion on Ruth's floor. Caleb looked down, then back up, and said no. Not honestly. Not with Ruth's comb. He said the comb had turned up exactly where Tanya's note said it would be. That one sentence changed the air in the office. But it landed clean. He did not throw his support all the way across the room. But he did say the truth, and in that building. That was something. Tanya kept her face calm. She knew how easy it was for a small truth to be taken back, if the wrong person leaned on it hard enough. Still, for one brief moment she was not standing there alone. Marjorie took that small crack and covered it with polished language. She said any successful return was the result of the hospital's team process, not one person's habit. Then she told Caleb that any future concerns about patient belongings needed to go through management. Not Tanya. The words were smooth, almost kind, if a person did not listen too closely. Tanya heard what was really being said. They wanted the benefit of her care without the trouble of naming it. They wanted her work to vanish into the idea of a team, while she stayed the one who could be blamed when things went missing. Tanya did not argue for credit. She only said patients needed their things returned correctly. That was the whole point. But even as she said it, she could feel the cost of being erased in plain sight. Later, while Tanya was collecting a card outside Marjorie's office, she saw a folder left just enough out of place to catch her eye. The cover was marked with repeated complaints about lost belongings. On the top page, in Marjorie's own handwriting, she saw a note beside more than one complaint. Tanya Whitaker usually finds before the report closes. There it was. Marjorie had known. Before anyone had to admit the mess. Tanya felt the shock first, then the anger, then something colder. She had not been fussing. She had been working inside someone else's blind spot, while that person used her silence to keep the reports clean. The truth was now in her hands, and it could ruin her if she used it wrong. The copied return slip reached Elliot's packet by way of a routine review. The kind of paper trail that usually looked dull until someone read it closely. Elliot tapped 2 fingers on the slip before he set it down. A habit he had when something did not fit. Clean and plain. And beside it was a return that Marjorie's weekly summary claimed had never needed correction. Elliot looked from the copy to the report, then back again. The other carried Tanya's signature proving otherwise. But he could see the shape of the problem already. A name had been attached to a correction the official story refused to admit. That was enough to make him look twice. Not enough to help. Not yet. But enough to notice that somebody had been left out of the story on purpose. Marjorie told Tanya the review would keep going, and then she took one weekend shift away until, as she put it, expectations were clear. The words were calm. That was what made them worse. Tanya heard the message all the way down to her bones. Her care had been useful enough to keep the hospital's reports clean. But now that same care had made her dangerous. She gathered her things, held her face steady, and walked out without asking for the shift back. She had miles to get home to. She had rent to think about. She had evidence tucked away in her bag and a new fear sitting right beside it. By the time she reached her son, the missing shift hit the house before dinner. Tanya sat at the kitchen table with a pencil, a grocery receipt, and the rent reminder folded into thirds beside her hand. She did the numbers again because sometimes doing them again felt like control. Even when the numbers stayed bad. Bus fare, milk, rice. The light bill. Too tight, all of it. And Tanya looked up fast enough to keep the fear off her face. She told him pancakes. He brightened at that, and she let him. She would make the batter stretch. She would make the evening feel normal if she had to carry it on her back. But the truth stayed there under the sweetness. And Tanya was already living on the edge of that tilt, trying to keep her son's world from feeling it. Elliot tapped 2 fingers on Tanya's signed return slip before he set it beside Marjorie's clean summary. The other had Tanya Whitaker's name on it and showed the correction had happened for real. He did not call it a mistake. He did not call it proof yet, either. He just asked his office assistant to pull 3 weeks of delivery notes and complaint calls. The request was quiet, but it carried weight, which meant she could not know that her careful work had traveled beyond Marjorie's control. Elliot was not acting from pity. He was following the shape of a contradiction, and the contradiction had Tanya's name on it. When Elliot came to the hospital asking about the small gaps in the records, Marjorie met him with polished folders and a smooth smile. She did not point to Tanya by name at first. She did something better for herself. She explained Tanya before Elliot could meet her. Low-wage staff, she said, sometimes overcomplicate simple returns when they get anxious about discipline. It sounded reasonable if a person was not listening too hard. Elliot listened too hard. He heard how quickly Tanya's name had been turned into a personnel problem. He heard how neatly Marjorie made the floor sound harmless and the worker sound difficult. The explanation stayed in the air, neat and closed, but it did not settle. The copy of Tanya's slip was too specific for that. Marjorie walked Elliot past the laundry area just as Tanya stopped a cart and reached into a pile of mixed bags. She had not known he was there for her. She was only doing what she always did, separating a mislabeled patient bag from the clean linens before it could disappear upstairs. Her hands moved fast, but not careless. Checked the room number and pulled the right bag free like she had done it 100 times before. Elliot saw the work as it was happening, not as Marjorie described it. There was no speech, no defense, no request for praise. Just a woman doing exact work under pressure while everybody else kept trying to call it background noise. Marjorie called her laundry, like the word could shrink her. She said the bag could follow the posted bin chart and that Tanya was making trouble out of nothing. Tanya did not raise her voice. She gave the patient's full name, the room move, and the simple fact that the wrong floor would lose the bag for good. That was all. No anger, no performance. Just facts, placed one after another. Steady as steps. Elliot could hear the difference between the room's polished language and Tanya's plain truth. He could also hear what it cost her to say it in front of a white manager who held her hours and a white man who had the kind of power people listen to. Tanya did not ask to be seen. She only made it impossible not to see her. Elliot asked her how she knew the bag was wrong. Tanya kept her eyes on the cart when she answered. Names get crossed out too easily when people are moved. No explanation of her cabinet. No hint about the notes she kept. No request for help. Tanya had already learned what it felt like when a powerful person showed interest too late and too close. She was not about to hand over the whole truth just because he was listening better than Marjorie. Elliot accepted the answer, but he could feel the shape of what was missing. From the kind of attention that could turn her care into another danger. Elliot did not press Tanya again. Instead he turned to Caleb, who had been watching from a few steps away with his hands tucked into his scrub pockets. He asked if patient belongings often ended up in the wrong place. Caleb looked toward the nurse's station before he answered. His voice stayed careful. He said it happened enough. Then, after a pause, he mentioned Ruth Ellison. The scarf, the pearl-handled comb. The note Tanya had kept when the official sheet had nothing useful on it. Tanya kept her eyes on the cart, but she heard every word. Caleb did not make himself bold. He did not say enough to protect her fully. Still, he said the part that mattered. Ruth had remembered correctly. And Tanya's note had matched the truth. Elliot listened without interrupting. A second piece had joined the first. Tanya was no longer one worker being stubborn over one bag. She was becoming a pattern in front of him. Ruth looked at Elliot and told him Tanya gave things back with the names still attached. She said Tanya never made her feel foolish for asking. Then she pointed slowly at the mended blue gown and the returned comb. Like those small things were the only witness she needed. Elliot watched her fingers settle on the fabric and saw something plain and hard to ignore. This was not about lost laundry. It was about a woman being able to keep hold of herself when the world was trying to file her down into a room number. Ruth's voice was soft, but it carried. Tanya's work had not just protected objects. It had protected a person's sense of being real. And now Elliot could see that the objects mattered because the person mattered. Elliot went back to Ruth's papers with the patience of a man who trusted documents more than feelings. He checked the gown, the comb, the room move, the dates. Caleb stood near him, quiet. Ruth watched from her chair, her hands resting over the soft blue fabric Tanya had mended. The hospital sheet had clean lines and blank spaces. It did not show the green scarf. It did not show the comb. It did not explain why Ruth had asked for the same things again and again until Tanya listened. Elliot tapped the page twice. Paper talks, he said softly. But it does not breathe. He did not smile when he said it. It sounded less like comfort than an admission. The sheet had authority. But Tanya's care had held more truth than the sheet could carry. In the parking lot, Elliot sat alone in his car with the engine off and the afternoon heat pressing against the windshield. He opened his wallet and pulled out a worn photo of his mother in a hotel uniform. Her hand resting on a laundry cart, her face tired but steady. For a moment, he did nothing but look at her. Then he put the photo away before the memory could soften him too much. He opened the folder again and returned to dates, calls, and complaints. That was how he kept himself honest. Feeling could point him toward a door. But facts had to unlock it. Tanya did not know any of this. She did not know that her labels and notes had brushed against an old hurt in a man who had spent years trying not to be fooled by emotion. She had only done the work. That was why it troubled him. The files from Elliot's office made the problem larger than one floor. 5 families in 2 months had called about vanished linens or personal things. One discharge had been held up because a patient's items could not be found. There were notes from the hospital asking his company to help make the numbers look orderly before donors started asking questions. Elliot sat with the papers spread across the passenger seat and read them twice. His review had not begun as routine curiosity. It had begun because trust was leaking out through small losses nobody wanted to name. Tanya's corrections sat inside that pattern like little knots tied in a fraying rope. A gown, a comb, an envelope, a mislabeled bag. They were not separate anymore. Her quiet work had been answering a wider failure, and that made her evidence more powerful. It also made her more exposed. When Elliot returned with sharper questions, Marjorie was ready with a cleaner version of the story. He asked for examples from the floor, something plain behind the family complaints. Marjorie smoothed the edge of her folder and said the issue was exactly why support staff needed tighter control. Informal habits confused the process, she said. People got well-meaning ideas and made simple systems harder than they needed to be. Tanya was nearby, close enough to hear her work turned into a warning. She felt the attention shift toward her like a cold draft. Marjorie was not denying the pattern now. She was aiming it downward. Elliot watched her while she spoke. The more quickly she placed Tanya at the center of the blame, the less easily he trusted the shape of her answer. But caution did not protect Tanya yet. It only made the danger sharper. At the end of the shift, Tanya was gathering her tote when Elliot approached without Marjorie beside him. He asked if she would be willing, another day, to walk him through one returned item trail from start to finish. Tanya thought of miles waiting for a steady mother. She thought of rent. The cut shift, and Marjorie's voice turning care into misconduct. Her hands tightened around the strap of her bag. She told Elliot she would tell the truth about her work. Then she added that she would not sign anything that made patients lost things her fault. Elliot held her gaze and nodded once. There was no rescue in it. No promise big enough to lean on. But he heard the boundary. Tanya walked away, still unsure whether his attention was shelter or another storm forming. What she knew was this. She had spoken without begging. And she had not handed him the right to define her. Tanya came home still carrying Elliot's request in her head. The way some words followed you across a whole night. He wanted her to walk him through the trail of a returned item. Start to finish. It was enough to make the air in her own kitchen feel thinner. But when she stepped inside, she found Miles awake at the table with his notebook open. He had been copying down patient names he remembered hearing her say. Careful and slow, like each one mattered. He looked up at her with that serious little face of his and said he was trying to help her not forget anything. Tanya stood there for a second, worn down to the bone and suddenly soft in the middle. Miles had picked up on her burden without being told. He was learning her habits, learning her care. That should have warmed her all the way through. It did, and it hurt too. She thanked him, gently closed the notebook, and kept the grown-up worry off his shoulders. He was a child. He should not have to carry this kind of weight just because he loved her enough to try. Denise came by the next morning with clean school shirts folded over one arm and a plastic grocery bag hanging from the other. She noticed the notebook before Tanya could move it. Miles, proud and nervous, told her he had been helping with names. Denise's face changed in a way Tanya knew too well. Soft at first, then full of memory she had not been invited to bring in. She said Tanya sounded just like Alberta, always worrying over what belonged to which person. Always acting like a name could hold a whole person together. Tanya closed the drawer a little harder than she meant to. Not today, Mama, she said. Denise went quiet. The shirts were real help. But she did not have room for old ghosts dressed up as conversation. Not with Elliot asking questions and Marjorie waiting for any reason to turn the truth against her. At the hospital, Tanya agreed to show Elliot one returned item trail. But she set the ground rules first. Caleb had to be there. The patient could not be embarrassed. And nobody was going to turn a person's private things into a lesson for somebody else's comfort. Then she walked Elliot through a mislabeled sweater, one piece at a time. The room move, the repair thread she recognized, the way Ruth remembered the floor she had been on before. Tanya did not explain herself like she was asking for approval. She just did the work of showing what she knew. Elliot watched closely, and this time he saw more than a worker with a good memory. He saw a standard. He saw that Tanya's care was built to protect people, not to make her look useful. She kept control of the evidence by setting the terms. And that mattered. It meant she was still the one deciding how much to reveal, even while she let him look. Marjorie stepped in before the moment could settle. She looked at Tanya and said, with that polished little smile of hers, that Tanya was turning laundry into a personal archive. Then she reminded Elliot that support staff were not trained to manage patient history. Her words were neat, but the sting was plain. Tanya stood there with the sweater trail still in her hands and felt the familiar insult of being reduced in front of people who were supposed to be listening. She was being challenged across race, class, and job status all at once. And Marjorie said it like she was protecting order. But Tanya answered anyway. She said she tracked belongings so people would not lose themselves. Not so she could own their stories. Elliot heard the difference. Caleb did too. Marjorie's language was all status. Tanya's was all people. And for the first time, Elliot could see that the thing Marjorie called overreach might actually be discipline with a heart in it. Elliot asked if Tanya had more examples. Not a demand. Not yet, just a question. Tanya held his eyes for a beat. Then went to her bag and brought out only copies. Not originals. The names were partly covered. The details were there. But she had protected what she could. She would not hand over the real papers until she knew nobody was going to use them against patients or turn them into a reason to punish her. That choice mattered. It showed she was learning that evidence could speak for her without making her helpless. She did not have to disappear into her own proof. She could keep hold of it. Elliot's face changed a little when he saw how carefully she had done that. Her caution was not secrecy for its own sake. It was care. He understood that much. And because he understood it, his respect for her deepened. Elliot took the copies in his hands, looked at them once, and then placed them right back in Tanya's palm. He told her the originals should stay with the person who had protected the names, at least until there was a safer way to review them. It was a small thing, but it landed like a real thing. Tanya had expected judgment, maybe even confiscation. What she got instead was restraint. He was not trying to take her work from her. He was recognizing that it belonged with her. That was the first real thaw between them. Not trust, not yet, but respect, solid and unshowy. Tanya held the papers again and felt the difference. A powerful man had not made a show of helping her. He had simply not taken what she had guarded. In her line of work, that counted for a lot. At home, Miles noticed something Tanya had not meant for anyone to notice. He saw that Elliot had returned the slips folded the same careful way Tanya folded school forms. Then he said Grandma Denise did the same thing with church offering envelopes whenever she talked about Alberta. Tanya looked at him, then down at the papers in her own hand, and felt that quiet shift that comes when a child tells you the family has been watching you all along. Miles had not solved anything. He did not know the risk hanging over her job or the reason she kept every name so carefully. But he knew the shape of her habit. He knew it came from somewhere older than this hospital. Older than this week. The way he said it made her think about the women before her. About the way care gets passed down without anyone calling it legacy until much later. For the first time, the pattern at home was starting to speak back. Tanya waited until Miles had gone quiet with his homework before she asked Denise about Alberta's old papers. The question was small, but Denise reacted like it had a hook in it. She said Tanya always wanted family history when trouble was already at the door. As if memory could be pulled down from a shelf only when it became useful. Tanya did not answer that. She let the hurt pass through the room without picking it up. After a while, Denise sat back and rubbed her thumb along the seam of one clean shirt. Alberta kept notebooks, she said. Not fancy ones. Just school composition books with residents' names written clear across the top. Clothes, buttons, dentures, photos, church shawls. Little things families forgot and staff called clutter. Alberta wrote them down because people forgot what mattered when the person was old. Sick, slow, or too tired to argue. Tanya listened with her hands folded tight in her lap. Denise was giving her truth, but even that truth came wrapped in old disappointment. So Tanya took what was useful and did not let the rest take over. She needed the memory. She did not need to become responsible for every year Denise had missed. Tanya found a small box of Alberta's things tucked away like they were waiting for her. Inside were worn thread cards, saved safety pins, a church program used as a bookmark, and copied pages written in the same clear block letters Tanya used on patient slips. She traced the lines slowly, almost afraid of how familiar they felt. The names came first, the objects came after. The rules were there, plain as daylight. This was not some vague family feeling. It was a method. A practiced way of keeping people from disappearing inside their own belongings. Tanya held the old papers and felt the strange mix of grief and steadiness that comes when something buried finally makes sense. Her care at the hospital was not random. It had a shape. It had roots. And now, in the worn paper and careful handwriting of Alberta's box, Tanya could see the line running straight from her grandmother's hands to her own. Denise found one of Alberta's notes tucked between old papers. The crease worn soft from being folded and unfolded. She read it aloud in a voice that did not sound as sure as it wanted to. Never let a person's things lose their name. For a second, the apartment seemed to hold still around those words. Tanya saw her own hospital slips in her mind. The covered names, the mended seams, the saved labels, the patient bags she kept from being swallowed by the wrong cart. She had thought of it as caution, as habit, as the only way to keep from letting Ruth and others disappear into the hospital's hurry. But Alberta had been doing the same thing years before. In elder care rooms where other people's mothers and fathers waited for somebody to remember what belonged to them. Miles looked from Denise to Tanya, quiet enough to understand that something important had been named. Tanya held the note like it might tear if she breathed too hard. What Marjorie called informal, what the hospital called unauthorized, had a root older than that building. It came from Alberta's hands. It came from black women doing careful work in places that needed them and rarely credited them. Tanya had not invented the method alone. She had inherited it. Tanya took Alberta's note into the narrow hallway and leaned against the wall where the paint had a chipped place near the light switch. Denise followed but did not crowd her. For once, she did not fill the silence with excuses. Tanya said she had been scared the hospital would treat her the way Alberta had been treated. The words came out low, almost plain, but they carried years inside them. Denise looked down at her own hands. Then she said Alberta would not have wanted Tanya buried under the care she gave. She would have wanted Tanya's name on it. Not for pride. For truth. Tanya closed her eyes because that kindness did not ask her to comfort anybody. It did not make her mother's guilt the center. It only placed Alberta's pride where Tanya could reach it. Staying hidden had always felt like a kind of safety. Now it felt less clean. If the work had a name and a history, then letting it be used without being named was another kind of loss. Tanya still feared Marjorie. She still feared a cut schedule and rent coming due. But she also began to understand that being seen did not have to mean begging. Sometimes it meant refusing to let a true thing be buried. The next night, Tanya brought Elliot a copied trail with the family parts removed. Alberta's name was not on the page. The grief was not there for anyone to handle or mishandle. But the method was clearer now. The name first. The item second. The room move, the repair, the return. Tanya told him only that she had learned to keep names with things long before she ever worked in that hospital. Elliot took the copy with both hands and studied it without rushing her. He did not ask who taught her, and that helped. Caleb stood nearby, watching the exchange like he knew something had shifted, but did not know the full shape of it. Across the nurse's station, Marjorie saw enough. Her eyes moved from Tanya to Elliot to the papers between them. Tanya felt it. That old pressure of being watched by someone who did not want her seen clearly. Still, she did not pull the page back. She had not given Elliot her wound. She had given him a clearer truth. And for the first time, the evidence carried a little of Alberta's strength into the open. Marjorie did not wait long. Before Tanya's next cart was finished, she called her into a small office off the hall and closed the door halfway. Not enough for privacy, just enough for control. Outside conversations about patient belongings, she said, could make support staff look like they were hiding mistakes. Her voice stayed calm. That was what made it sharp. Tanya stood with her badge still crooked from the shift and listened to the warning dress itself up as concern. The copied trail had done exactly what Tanya feared and what she needed. It had made her work harder to ignore. Marjorie wanted that visibility turned into suspicion before it could become respect. Tanya felt the pull to step back to tuck the papers away, to protect her hours by becoming small again. But Alberta's note was still alive in her mind. Names did not become mistakes because somebody powerful did not want them spoken. Tanya kept her shoulders straight and said truthful records were not the same as hiding. Marjorie's smile thinned. The threat remained in the room after the meeting ended, quiet and polished, following Tanya out like another assignment. At home, the rent money sat on the table in small stacks that did not add up the way Tanya needed. One missing shift had a way of making every dollar look lonely. Miles watched her count, then asked if she was going to lose her job. He had heard Denise say adults did not start asking questions unless something was wrong. Tanya stopped with a $10 bill under her fingers. She wanted to tell him no and make the fear leave his face. But false comfort had never held long in their house. She told him that sometimes telling the truth made people nervous. And sometimes it made things hard for a while. Then she said hard did not mean wrong. Miles looked down at his notebook, quiet and serious. Denise stood near the sink, saying nothing for once. Tanya reached across the table and touched her son's wrist. She could not promise that Marjorie would be fair. She could not promise that money would stretch just because they needed it to. What she could give him was a softer truth than silence. She would not teach him that dignity had to disappear just to keep the lights on. Denise had been talking for a minute before Tanya realized how close she was to saying something true. They sat at the table with Miles nearby, his pencil paused over his notebook. And Denise kept circling around Alberta, like she was afraid to step on a bruise. She said Alberta did not teach all that labeling just so Tanya could hide it now. Then Tanya asked the question that had been sitting in her chest for years. She asked why nobody in the family ever said straight out what happened during Alberta's last care stay. Denise's mouth opened, then shut. She looked away toward the sink, then back down at her hands. That was all it took to tell Tanya there was more there. Not just sadness, not just age. Something had been neglected, and Denise had been carrying the shape of it ever since. Tanya did not soften her voice to save her mother from it. She let the silence stay hard. If there was truth in that story, she wanted it all the way, not in pieces wrapped around somebody else's guilt. Tanya carried that unfinished conversation back to the hospital with her. It sat under her ribs while she pushed carts and checked tags. Heavy and unnamed. On Ruth's floor, she noticed the wrong sweater before anyone said a word. Ruth's labeled cardigan was gone, replaced by a rough spare one that sat too high at the neck. Ruth kept pulling at the collar with 2 careful fingers, trying not to complain. When Tanya stepped closer, Ruth said nobody believed the cardigan mattered because it was not medical. The sentence struck Tanya harder than it should have. Not medical. Not urgent. Not worth stopping for. She had heard that kind of thinking all her life in different clothes. Caleb stood near the doorway, tired and watching. Tanya asked Ruth where the cardigan had last been seen, and Ruth gave a small embarrassed shrug. Tanya could feel Marjorie's warning pressing at her back. Stay in your lane. Do not interfere. But Ruth's skin was reddening where the fabric rubbed. And the look on her face was not confusion. It was the quiet shame of needing something others had decided was minor. Tanya's voice stayed gentle. She told Ruth she would look. Not because the sweater was important on a form, but because Ruth was important in her own body. On Ruth's floor, Tanya found Caleb standing near the bed with his arms folded, looking tired in the way tired men look when they are trying not to be pulled into something they can already see. Ruth was bent a little in the spare sweater they had given her, and every time she shifted, she pulled her shoulders up with a small wince. Tanya pointed to the cardigan folded on the chair and asked Caleb to note it down as a comfort need. Nothing fancy, just the truth. Caleb said Marjorie would call it non-essential. He said it like he had said that kind of thing too many times before. Then Ruth tried to adjust the rough sweater again and flinched. Just enough for him to see it. He looked at her. Then at Tanya, then at the little cardigan sitting there like it had no right to matter. After a second, he pulled out his pen and wrote the note. Plain words, no argument, no speech. Just a small, honest line on paper. Tanya did not thank him like he had saved the world. She only gave him a look that said she saw the risk he had finally taken. Marjorie saw Caleb's note before the moment had even had time to cool. Her face stayed smooth, but her voice sharpened. She told Tanya that involving clinical staff and laundry preferences looked an awful lot like blame shifting. Then she said the pending review could become a final warning if this pattern kept up. Tanya felt the words hit low and hard. It was one thing to be dismissed. It was another to be told that doing right for a patient might cost her the job. She needed to keep her rent paid and miles in one piece. She did not rip the note up. She did not pretend Ruth had been fine in that rough sweater. She just stood there and took in what had changed. Caleb had moved one step closer to courage, and Marjorie had moved one step closer to punishing it. Tanya could feel the balance shifting, but not in her favor yet. If anything, the truth had become more dangerous the moment someone else wrote it down. Elliot heard about the final warning from the papers, moving through his review and from Caleb's name appearing in the wrong place at the wrong time. He sat with the complaint pattern spread out in front of him and traced it with his finger. One family call after another, one missing belonging after another. Then he asked Caleb a question that mattered more than the rest. Had Tanya caused harm, or had she been preventing it? Caleb hesitated, because either answer carried weight. Elliot could see that. That was what changed him a little. He was no longer just comparing records. He was standing at the edge of what the records meant. If he waited too long, Marjorie would punish the woman whose work had been keeping the whole thing from falling apart. If he moved too fast, he might make the wrong kind of mistake. But doing nothing had its own cost, and Elliot was finally seeing that clearly. Tanya was not in the room, but her work was. Her work was what he had to answer now. Caleb finally said it out loud. Tanya's notes had kept more than one patient from losing things that mattered to them. More than once, the hospital sheet had been wrong and Tanya's little copied details had been right. He admitted he had stayed quiet because he did not want to be marked difficult again. The words came out rough, like they had been sitting in him for a long time. Elliot listened without interrupting. That mattered too. Caleb was not trying to become a hero in that moment. He was just telling the truth about his own fear. And in doing that, he made Tanya's burden clearer. She had not only been carrying the work. She had been carrying the silence around the work. The kind that lets everybody else stay comfortable while one person keeps the truth alive. Elliot saw that now. So did Caleb, probably more than he wanted to. The harm was not only in what had been lost. It was in how long everybody else had let Tanya stand alone with the answer. Elliot did not tell the whole story about his mother. He only said enough for Caleb to understand why this mattered to him in a way paperwork never could. His mother had once been written up as unreliable when she was actually covering for unsafe work. She had been protecting other people and got blamed for the trouble anyway. Elliot let that sit there between them. Then he said he would not call Tanya difficult until the evidence proved harm instead of hidden help. It was a careful sentence because careful was the only way he trusted himself to be fair. Caleb looked at him a long second, because now it was plain that Elliot was not just checking boxes. He was deciding what kind of man he wanted to be in the face of a story that looked too familiar. The room did not get softer, but it got more honest. And for Tanya, somewhere behind all of this, that honesty was starting to matter. Denise handed Tanya the packet from Alberta's last care place. And Tanya felt the room change before anybody said another word. The pages were thin at the edges, the kind of papers people handle often and still do not want to face. Denise told her the missing glasses, the mislabeled sweater, and the meal notes no one paid attention to had all been brushed off as small confusion. Just little mistakes. Just a bad day. Just things that did not seem worth slowing down for. But they had mattered. They had mattered until Alberta stopped asking. They had mattered until she weakened more than anyone wanted to admit. Tanya sat very still with the packet in her hands and felt the old fear she had carried for years come into focus. This was the same kind of neglect. The same kind of dismissal. The same quiet way of telling a vulnerable woman that her comfort was too small to count. And now Tanya could see it clearly. What she had been doing at the hospital was not fussiness. It was not overwork for the sake of overwork. It was an answer. A refusal to let somebody disappear by inches while everyone called it nothing. Miles asked the question first. He was sitting cross-legged on the rug, watching Tanya hold Alberta's packet in one hand and Ruth's copied trail in the other. He asked if Grandma Alberta had been ignored the way Ruth was. Tanya felt that land in her chest like a stone. She told him people ignored things they should have honored. That was all she could say at first. Then she stood up, crossed to the cabinet, and stopped before she put either packet away. She did not hide them again. She brought them back to the table and laid them out beside the notebook. Beside the labels, beside the work she had been keeping quiet. If silence protected her job for one more week, maybe. But silence also taught Miles that dignity had to stay buried to survive. Tanya would not pass that lesson down to him. Not after Alberta, and not after Ruth, so she kept the papers out in the open. It was not a victory yet. It was a decision. And it meant she was done pretending this could stay tucked away forever. By the time Tanya spoke to Elliot and Caleb, the decision had already settled deep in her. She would let the copied trails be reviewed, but only if Ruth's dignity stayed protected and nobody tried to use Alberta's story like a sad little prop. She said it plain. No pity, no performance. No one getting to hold her grief up to the light just because it made the room feel more righteous. Elliot listened. Caleb listened too. Marjorie stood near enough to see the meeting forming. And Tanya could feel the shift in her before she even moved. Marjorie was already preparing her own version of events. Already getting ready to make Tanya sound like the problem before the truth had a chance to breathe. Tanya knew what she was risking. Her job. Her hours. Miles's steadiness. But she also knew silence could keep repeating the same harm that had taken Alberta. So she did not back away. She stood there with her proof and her boundaries and let the room see that she was willing to be reviewed, not erased. The meeting notice came from Marjorie like a clean little knife. Tanya opened the paper and read that her repeated unauthorized handling of patient belongings, her informal notes, and her workflow delays would be reviewed, with possible final discipline. The language was neat. The threat was not. It reached past one shift and settled over the rest of her life. Tanya looked at the notice while Miles was sitting nearby, and she knew at once what it could cost. Work, rent, school stability, all of it. Marjorie had taken Tanya's care and translated it into wrongdoing. That was the part that stung deepest. Not just that she was being blamed, but that the very things she had done to protect vulnerable people were now being used against her. Still, Tanya did not crumple the paper. She did not hide it from herself. She read every word and let the weight of it land. Then she folded it once, slow and careful, like she was refusing to let Marjorie define the whole story by herself. Miles brought home a school reminder about a parent meeting on pickup changes, and Tanya felt the timing of it like a hard knot in her chest. The disciplinary meeting Marjorie had set was on the very same morning Tanya was supposed to reassure his teacher. It meant she could not be in both places. It meant 2 different rooms could decide what kind of mother she was. Tanya stood at the table with the paper in one hand and Miles watching her face, trying not to look scared. Denise was there too, and for once Tanya did not try to carry the whole thing alone. She marked both times on the calendar, then asked Denise for one specific favor, something practical she could count on. Not a promise wrapped in guilt. Just help with the pickup if the meeting ran long. That was the shape of her dignity in that moment. Not pretending everything was fine. Not spilling fear all over the child. Just asking clearly for what would keep the day from breaking apart. Before dawn, Tanya spread her evidence out on the kitchen table and made herself look at it like a person building a case instead of a woman trying to survive another bad week. There were copied patient trails, Ruth's gown tag, the note about the scarf and the pearl comb, the slip showing the envelope returned, Caleb's note about the cardigan, and Alberta's rule copied down without the personal parts. Tanya moved each piece into place with care. She did not want to expose Ruth. She did not want to turn Alberta's pain into a performance. She wanted truth, and she wanted it handled cleanly. So she chose what could be shared and what had to stay private. She arranged everything by name, date, and return. By what had been protected. By what had been restored. When she finished, the table looked less like a pile of scraps, and more like a life lived carefully enough to leave a trail. Tanya sat back and understood that the trail was hers. She had carried it. She would decide how it was used. Tanya told Elliot she would let him compare the copied trails with the delivery and complaint records. But only if the originals stayed with her and Ruth's name was handled with care. She did not soften it. She did not rush to make herself easy to trust. She laid out the terms the way Alberta would have wanted them laid out. Clear and plain. Elliot looked at her for a long second before answering. He did not argue. He did not reach for the papers like they belonged to him. That mattered. Tanya could feel the old instinct to brace against being used. But she stayed where she was and held the line. Elliot's access could help. His reach could make the truth harder to bury. But she was not handing over her authority with the copies. She was lending him a way to see. That was a different thing. And Tanya made sure the difference stayed visible. If he wanted her trust, he would have to earn it by respecting the people whose names she had protected. Caleb stood with his pen in hand and looked at the paper as if he needed one more breath before he trusted himself to use it. Tanya said nothing. She had already done the part that was hers. She had brought the truth forward. Now it was Caleb's turn to decide what kind of witness he wanted to be. Elliot waited too, quiet and still, the way some men get when they are listening hard enough to change their minds. Caleb finally wrote it down. Ruth's comb had matched Tanya's note. The cardigan had hurt to wear. Patients kept asking Tanya where their things had gone because the official sheets did not hold what the people on the floor actually needed. His hand moved slow, but it moved. Tanya did not thank him like he had rescued her. She just took in the fact that he had chosen to stand beside the truth in his own name. That mattered. It mattered because now her care was not only her word against Marjorie's. It had another voice, one the hospital could not dismiss so easily. The pressure did not go away, but it shifted. And for the first time in a long while, Tanya could feel the truth standing a little firmer. Tanya asked Ruth if her returned belongings could be mentioned. And Ruth answered her in that slow, steady way of hers that made every word count. Yes, she said. She wanted to speak for herself. Then she added that Tanya had remembered her when the papers did not. Tanya let that settle before she moved another inch. She had not wanted to use Ruth like proof. She had wanted to protect her. So when Ruth chose to stand inside the truth instead of being handled around it, Tanya gave her that space with both hands. It changed the room. Ruth was no longer just a frail patient with a lost comb and a misplaced cardigan. She was a witness. A person whose memory still mattered. And because Tanya had treated her that way from the start, Ruth's words now carried weight. The kind of weight official papers often fail to hold. Tanya looked at her and felt the quiet ache of it. This was what care was supposed to do, not erase people. Return them to themselves. Elliot spread the carpet trails, Caleb's statement, Ruth's words, complaint dates, and delivery records across the table and began comparing them one by one. He did not rush. He tapped the paper with 2 fingers before each line, like he was asking the page to tell the truth straight. What he found kept turning the whole picture around. Tanya's corrections were showing up just before complaints were marked closed. The missing things were often found after she had already done. The hard work of matching names to items and putting people back in touch with what belonged to them. That changed everything. It meant she had not been creating confusion. She had been cleaning up confusion that already existed. Quietly. Repeatedly, without credit. Elliot sat back for a second and looked toward Tanya. She still had her hands folded, still guarded, still careful not to ask for more than the facts. But now the facts were starting to line up around her in a way that could not be waved off as personality or fussiness. This was a pattern, a real one. And it was beginning to show that Tanya had been the reason disorder had not become visible in the first place. Marjorie moved fast once she saw the shape of the pattern. She did not argue with the facts. She tried to rename them. A draft summary started making its way around, smooth and polished. Saying Tanya's informal handling had caused confusion around patient property, staff time, and family complaints. The message was plain enough once you listened closely. The hospital was going to turn her care into the problem and call tighter discipline the answer. Tanya read the draft once and felt anger rise hot and clean in her chest. Not because it accused her. That part she had already learned to expect. It was because it tried to take the very things she had protected and use them as proof that she should not have protected them. Caleb's note, Ruth's words, Elliot's records, Alberta's method, all of it suddenly sat in the shadow of a paper meant to make Tanya look like the cause of the mess. Private recognition was no longer enough. Not if the official story stayed false. Marjorie had moved first. Now the truth had to move louder. The draft reached Tanya at the same time Denise called from Miles's school. The teacher wanted to know if Tanya's schedule was stable enough to keep up the pickup plan. Tanya stood still with the phone against her ear and the paper in her other hand. And for a second it felt like the whole day was asking the same question. Was she steady or not? Could she be counted on or not? Marjorie's draft said one thing. The school wanted another. Miles was listening from the sofa. Trying not to look afraid, but he heard enough to know this was not small. Tanya told Denise to reassure him with facts, not worry. She did not want Miles thinking his mother's fight at work meant she was falling apart at home. But the truth was that the lie being written at the hospital could reach all the way into rent, wages, and the way the school saw her. One story could cost her the hours she needed. Another could make her look unreliable as a mother. That was the real weight of it. Not just a report. A whole life being measured by somebody else's version of her. Tanya looked around the room at Elliot, Caleb, Denise, and Miles. And something in her settled. If Marjorie was putting Tanya's name on the blame, then Tanya's truth was not going to stay hidden just to keep everybody comfortable. She said it plain. The returned items, the patient words. The repaired things, Alberta's way of keeping names with belongings. All of it would have to be named if the truth was going to survive. She was done letting a false story carry her name. No more pretending the evidence was just a private safety net. If it was going to protect anyone now, it had to stand up in the open. Tanya felt the risk of that choice immediately. Silent survival had always seemed safer. But silence would teach Miles that dignity had to stay invisible to survive. She could not pass that lesson on to her son. Not after everything that had already happened. So she chose the harder thing. She chose to let the truth speak, even if it cost her the fragile peace she had been clinging to. Elliot did not soften what he had found. He laid it out. Marjorie's draft was not just about Tanya getting disciplined. It would let the hospital close family complaints, explain away staff delays, hide repeated failures with patient property, and make Tanya's careful work look like the cause of the whole mess. That was the real shape of it. A scapegoat account. Tanya felt the room go tight around her, not because she had done something wrong, but because she could see how easy it would be for a polished paper to bury a low-wage woman's truth. If the evidence stayed buried, she might carry the blame for problems her care had spent months softening or preventing. That was the cruel part. The person who had been holding things together was the one they were preparing to point at. Denise's face changed as she heard it. Caleb went still. Miles looked from one adult to another, trying to understand why grown people could make a lie sound so neat. The danger was no longer just discipline. It was erasure. And Tanya knew then that this was bigger than her job. The danger in Marjorie's draft made everybody in the room quieter. Then one by one, the quiet started turning into action. Caleb said his statement could be attached with his name on it. Not whispered in a hallway. Not kept as something he might admit later. Written down. Ruth gave permission for the corrected belongings to be named, as long as her words were not softened into something easier for people to ignore. Denise offered what she knew about Alberta's way of keeping names with belongings. And for once she did not push herself into the center of it. She let the family history stand behind Tanya, not in front of her. Elliot said he would ask that Tanya's evidence be heard before any discipline was finalized. Tanya listened to each promise and did not melt into gratitude. She had not been waiting for rescue. These were witnesses answering what her work had already proved. The report still had weight. Marjorie still had a polished version ready. But Tanya was no longer the only person willing to let the truth have a name. Tanya walked into the review room with her copied trails in one hand and Caleb's statement in the other. Ruth's permission was in the stack too, along with Alberta's rule written in Tanya's own words. Elliot came only to verify access. That mattered. He was not there to speak for her. He was there to help make sure the truth could be seen. Marjorie's polished report was already waiting on the table, smooth and neat and ready to blame. Tanya set her papers down anyway. She did not beg the room to believe her. She did not raise her voice. She just brought the proof into the open and stood behind it. Every one of the people she had protected. Every name she had kept straight. Every repaired seam and returned belonging, all of it now sat beside the official account. The room had to look at both. Tanya's job, her hours. Miles's stability and the meaning of Alberta's legacy all hung there together. The truth was no longer hidden in a cabinet. It was in the room now. And nobody could say they had not been given a chance to see it. Marjorie opened the review like she had opened every hard conversation, with a smooth hand over the corner of the paper and a voice that made blame sound reasonable. She said Tanya's informal handling had created confusion. She said the hospital needed a clear path forward. The administrator glanced at the clock and asked Tanya to keep her explanation brief because the morning schedule was tight. Tanya felt the old pressure come back at once. Be quick. Be agreeable. Make the truth small enough to fit the room's patience. She looked down at the folder in her lap, then at the names written across the first page. Ruth Ellison, the discharged man with the envelope. The patient whose sweater had been sent to the wrong floor. Tanya lifted her eyes and said she could be clear. But she would not rush the names. They were not examples to her. They were people. The administrator heard her, not fully. Not yet. But the room shifted just a little, because Tanya had refused to let her evidence begin as shorthand. Tanya started with the things that had survived being overlooked. She placed the copy of the mended gown label on the table first. Then the note about Ruth's green scarf and pearl comb. Then Caleb's note about the cardigan. Then the slip showing the envelope had been returned where it belonged. Each paper was plain, no fancy language. Just a name. A date, a place, and the path back from being lost. Marjorie's report sat beside them, smooth and official, but Tanya's pages had something it did not. They had people attached to them. They showed what had been wrong before she touched it, and what had been corrected after she did. Tanya did not ask anyone to feel sorry for her. She did not make a speech about sacrifice. She let the copies rest there in a careful line. Small saved things. Small repaired things. The kind of things a busy system called minor until someone had to live without them. Across the table, Elliot leaned in. The administrator's eyes moved from one paper to the next. Marjorie kept still, but the neat shape of her report had begun to lose its hold. Caleb cleared his throat before he spoke, and everyone looked at him. His voice was tired, but this time it did not turn away. He said Ruth's comb was not clutter. The cardigan was not just a clothing preference. For a patient recovering slowly, those things helped her remember herself and stay comfortable in a place that changed around her without asking. He said Tanya's note had matched what they found, while the official sheet had missed it. Then he said the same problem had shown up more than once. Tanya kept her hand still in her lap. She knew what it cost him to say it in front of Marjorie. But she also knew the truth had not become his because he finally spoke. It remained rooted in the care she had given before anybody important was listening. Caleb's words did something useful, though. They made it harder for the room to treat her as a woman with a private habit and easier to see the work as something that had protected patients from real harm. Ruth's statement was read slowly, the way Ruth had written it, with every simple word allowed to stand. She said Tanya had given her things back with her name attached. She said the papers made her feel like a room number. But Tanya remembered the woman inside the room. Nobody spoke for a moment after that. Even Marjorie did not move right away. Tanya looked down. Not from shame, but because the tenderness of it almost asked too much of her. Ruth had not been used. She had chosen to speak. That mattered more than anybody in the room seemed to understand. Her frail handwriting carried the weight of being dismissed and then believed. It turned the gown, the comb, and the cardigan into more than belongings. They became proof that losing small things could make a person feel less present in her own life. Tanya stayed quiet. She would not turn Ruth's gratitude into a performance. But the words had entered the room now, and they made the clean report feel colder than it had before. Marjorie recovered first. She gave a small nod, the kind that looked generous if someone did not know her. She said she was glad Ruth had been helped. Then she folded the whole thing down into one touching patient story. One exception. One kind gesture that still did not change the fact that Tanya had bypassed the proper channels and slowed the staff workflow. Tanya heard the trap in it. Praised the care just enough to make discipline sound fair. Let the room feel warm for Ruth, then put Tanya back in her place. The administrator's pen hovered above the paper. Caleb's jaw tightened. Elliot watched Marjorie without expression. Tanya did not argue with sentiment, because sentiment was not the ground she had come to stand on. She reached for the next part of the record instead. If Marjorie wanted Ruth to be a single soft story, then the pattern would have to answer. The work had never been one moment of niceness. It had been a method, repeated under pressure, and Tanya was ready to show that. Elliot laid the delivery records and the family complaint dates across the table and showed what they had been missing. Tanya's labels and returns appearing before complaints were marked resolved. More than once. Not once as a fluke and not once with her name where it belonged. The room went quiet as the pattern started to show. This was no longer only about Ruth's gown or one careful repair. It was a pattern. Tanya had been fixing problems the hospital later claimed were already handled. She had been doing it without credit, without protection, and without anyone on the paper side of the building knowing how much of the place depended on her. Marjorie could still talk about team process. She could still hide behind procedure. But the outside records matched Tanya's notes too closely for that now. The evidence had weight, and for the first time, it was on Tanya's side in a room full of people who could not pretend not to see it. Denise spoke next, and her voice carried a softness Tanya did not often hear from her in public. She said Alberta Whitaker had taught Tanya to keep names with belongings because losing a person's things could make them disappear faster. Then Denise stopped. She did not tell the whole room every wound. She did not make Alberta's pain into a story for people to consume. She looked at Tanya and let the rest belong to her. Tanya took that space. She explained how she had used the same rule at the hospital. Name first, then item. Then where it came from, where it needed to go, and what detail would keep it from being lost again. It was not guessing, it was not fussing. It was a practice. Learned at home, carried into work, sharpened by need. Miles sat close to Denise, listening hard, and Tanya could feel him hearing something change. The room was no longer looking at her notes as random scraps from an over-involved worker. They were seeing discipline, memory, a black family's caregiving standard brought into a place that had depended on it without ever knowing its name. Outside the room, Miles had been sitting with Denise and pretending to keep writing in his notebook. But when the administrator asked for Tanya Whitaker's notes by her full name, he stopped. He looked up fast. That was the moment it landed for him. Not laundry, not the lady in the uniform. Tanya Whitaker, his mother, said like a name that mattered. Miles had been carrying the fear that all of this trouble might cost them their stability. That truth might come with a price too high for their little family to pay. But now he could hear adults using her name with care instead of cutting it down to a job. It changed his face before he even knew it had changed. Tanya did not have to perform anything for him. She did not have to explain why it hurt or why it mattered. He saw it. He saw that her quiet work could be spoken of with respect. And that simple fact, heard from just beyond the door, gave her restraint a witness she could feel all the way across the room. The administrator asked for the papers to be laid out side by side. And Tanya did exactly that, her copied trails. The room moves. The repairs, the returns, the names. Beside them sat the hospital's official sheets. And the difference was ugly in a quiet way. Blank spaces where there should have been details. Crossed out names. Complaints marked resolved with no real human story behind them. Tanya did not say the hospital was lying. She did not need to. The papers showed it clearly. What she had kept in her hands was more complete than the clean version on the official side of the table. More human too, the administrator could see it now. Everyone could. The formal record looked neat, but it was thin. Tanya's record had all the lived weight the other one lacked. It held what actually happened. That meant her stewardship had not been extra. It had been the thing keeping reality from falling through the cracks. And once that was clear, the polished sheets lost their power to pretend they told the whole story. Marjorie tried one more time to keep control of the room. She said Tanya should have brought the problem up through proper channels. She said the hospital had steps for this kind of thing. Elliot did not let that sit. He pointed to Marjorie's own note, the one that said Tanya usually found things before the report closed, and asked the question everybody needed to hear. Why was Tanya's name useful in private and missing in credit? The question changed the room, because it showed Marjorie had not just overlooked Tanya. She had depended on her. She had known Tanya's work was valuable and still let her be treated like the problem when that same work became visible. No spectacle, no shouting. Just the plain fact of her own words turning back on her. Tanya did not have to weaponize anything. She did not have to humiliate Marjorie. The note did the work, and the room could see now that the person who kept calling for proper process had been quietly benefiting from Tanya's invisible labor all along. By the time the pieces were all together, the truth was too big to stay small. Tanya's labels, her repairs, her notes, and her returns had done more than defend her from blame. They had kept patient trust from breaking apart. They had closed complaints. They had steadied nurses who were too tired to keep chasing missing things. They had made the hospital look humane when the formal system kept failing to carry the human work. That was the part nobody could ignore anymore. Tanya had not just been helping one patient. She had been holding up a whole hidden structure of care. And the people in the room knew it now. The low-status worker they had treated as an inconvenience was the one making the place believable. Making it livable. Making it look like it still remembered people had names. That kind of truth changed the room. It changed what everyone owed her. And it left Tanya standing there as the source of something the hospital had depended on, without ever learning how to say thank you in the right way. The administrator said Tanya's pending discipline would be paused, and the report could not move forward as written. It was a start. But Tanya did not let that be the end of the conversation. She said pausing blame was not the same as changing the conditions that made her invisible in the first place. That was the line that mattered. She was not asking for a pat on the back. She was not asking to be relieved and sent back to the same broken setup. She was asking for the truth to become something solid. Something that would not disappear the next time a manager wanted clean numbers and a quiet floor. The room could feel the difference in her voice. She had been seen. Yes, but she was still steering what that seeing would mean. And now it was clear that if the hospital wanted her truth, it would have to accept her terms too. Because Tanya was not going to let recognition slide backward into the old order and call that justice. Marjorie gathered her papers without looking at Tanya. That told its own story. She had lost the room, and she knew it. The administrator asked Tanya and Elliot to come back with a practical correction plan. Something the hospital could actually live with, instead of another polished excuse. Tanya held her papers close and listened as her name was spoken out loud. Not as laundry, not as a problem, but as the person whose method the hospital now needed to understand. Miles heard it too. He was young, but he was not too young to feel the difference between being talked about and being named with respect. Tanya had won the truth of what she had done. She had not yet won the shape that truth would take in the future. That part was still open. But as she walked out with her evidence in her hands, she carried something she had not had before. Her name was no longer being used to reduce her. It was being used to begin again. When the administrator asked what would keep patient belongings from disappearing again, Tanya answered without hesitation. Her name could not be used to fix the system unless the work was protected. Paid, scheduled, and credited. She said it plainly, like somebody who had already given enough of herself to know the difference between being honored and being used. The hospital wanted a clean correction plan. Tanya wanted proof that the old burden would not simply be placed back on her shoulders under a softer name. That was the line she drew, fairly, calmly, and it changed the room again. Because now the truth was not only that she had been right. It was that she knew what right looked like when it had to become real. Elliot could see that. The administrator could see it too. Tanya was no longer just the worker who had uncovered the problem. She was the person who understood how to keep it from returning. And she was not handing that knowledge over for free. Elliot offered something concrete. He said he could support a trial system with proper labels. Locked storage, delivery tracking, and training materials. Not as a handout. Not as a favor. As a way to make sure what Tanya had built with her own hands would not be lost the next time the floor got busy or the paperwork got sloppy. Then he said the part that mattered most. Tanya should lead it. His records had only found what her hands had already saved. Tanya felt that land in her chest, like a weight that was finally the right shape. He was not trying to own her correction. He was not asking her to be grateful for being noticed. He was offering tools, and he was placing the authority where it belonged. The power in the room shifted because of that. His resources could serve her design now. Her judgment would shape how the work got done. What she had given without expecting anything back was starting to return as protection and as real help, not charity. The administrator followed that with something even more solid. Tanya would not just be put back on the carts and told to be thankful. She was being offered a protected lead role for patient belongings on the rehabilitation floors. Her weekend hours would come back. Her daytime planning time would be steadier. And the mark of discipline that had been hanging over her would be taken off her record. Tanya stood very still as the words settled. This was not a windfall. It was not some lucky break from nowhere. It was work turning into standing. Rent meant something. Hours meant something. A record meant something. The shape of her days meant something. Miles's life meant something too. Because every stable hour at work gave her a little more room to be his mother without panic sitting in the background. Her dignity was no longer just something she held inside. It had become something the hospital had to respect on paper, in pay, and in the way it now named her role. Marjorie did not fall apart or face a public spectacle. The administrator simply removed her from direct oversight of patient belonging reports for the trial and required every summary to include the names of the staff who did the work. That was enough to change the room. Marjorie gathered her folders in silence. And for once there was nowhere comfortable for her eyes to land. No one had to cheer. No one had to gloat. Tanya did not gloat. She did not even look pleased in a showy way. She just stood there while the consequence of the truth settled around the person who had tried to shrink her. Marjorie had spent so long using tidy language to narrow Tanya's life that now the same calm kind of language was narrowing hers. Her control over the story was gone. Her version could not stand alone anymore. And because the credit had to be named now, Tanya's work could not be quietly swallowed back into the system the next time things got busy. Then came the part Tanya could not have asked for. Not in her old life. The hospital was not simply sending her back to the carts with a nicer title. It was building a named stewardship practice around what she had already proved. Tanya would lead it. She would have training credit, protected time, a direct path for patient belonging concerns. And her method would be the starting standard. Alberta's hand, carried through Tanya, would now have a place in the open. Tanya felt the risk and the relief at the same time. Visibility had always meant danger to her. Being seen had always seemed like something that cost too much. But this was different. This was visibility with protection attached to it. Not a spotlight, but a structure. Not praise, but authority. She was not being folded back into the old order. She was being given the right to shape a new one, and that changed everything. That evening, Tanya told Miles the new schedule meant she would not be rushing out the door the way she had been. There would be fewer missed pickups. One regular morning each week. Time for school breakfast, without both of them counting the minutes. Miles listened with his notebook open on the table, his pencil moving careful and slow. Then he wrote Tanya's full name beside Alberta's. Tanya saw it and had to look away for a second. It was too much and just enough. Her son had started to understand that her work was not shameful background noise. It was something with a name, a shape, and a purpose. It was something worth writing down. The stability she had been fighting for finally had a form he could feel in his own day. A mother with less fear in her face. A house with a little more breathing room. A child who could learn pride without needing to pretend hardship had never been there. On Tanya's first protected training shift, the laundry room felt different. Though the carts still squeaked and the dryers still hummed like tired engines. She had a small table now, a box of clean labels. And time that was actually counted as work. Near the end of the hall, a young housekeeping aide stood with a veteran patient's worn cap in her hands, trying to explain that it had come up in the wrong bin, and she was brushed aside by someone already moving too fast. Tanya saw the aide's shoulders draw in. She knew that motion. She had lived inside it for years. So Tanya stepped over and asked the aide her name. The young woman answered softly, and Tanya repeated it clearly. Then she told Caleb, who was passing with a chart, that the aide had caught the mistake before the patient had to ask twice. She did not take the cap from her like the correction belonged to someone higher up. She showed the aide how to write the patient's name. Room and item on a simple label, then handed her a small kit with tape, tags, and a pen that would not smear. The veteran got his cap back before worry had time to harden into complaint. The aide looked surprised, then steadier. Tanya did not ask for thanks. She just made room for another worker's care to be seen while it was still early enough to protect it. Elliot watched Tanya credit the aide and tapped 2 fingers lightly on the new training page before he spoke. He said the practice should carry Tanya's name because the proof came from her work. Tanya did not say yes right away. She looked at the page, then at the aide, then back at Elliot, and she made sure the room heard her answer clearly. If her name went on it, then every worker who protected a name had to be named too. That was the line. Not ownership. Not ego. Responsibility. Elliot accepted that without pushing. And that changed the shape of what they were building. He could keep opening doors, but he would not own the room. Tanya would keep the authority over the practice, because she had earned it and because the work only stayed honest if credit stayed shared. That was how the story settled, not with rescue, not with dependence. With boundaries, respect, and a new way of seeing people who had been hidden in plain sight. At the end of the day, Tanya walked out through the front hall with Miles beside her. Her corrected badge rested against her uniform, showing her full name and the new lead role in plain letters. Miles kept glancing at it, not saying much but walking a little closer than usual. Behind them, the new patient property board held names in clean rows. Room numbers, returned items, staff initials, all written plainly enough that a person could be followed back to what belonged to them. Down the hall, the young aide returned the veteran's cap to its hook before he had to ask where it was. Caleb saw it happen and smiled to himself. Elliot stood near the doors with his coat over one arm. Not directing anything, not owning the moment, just watching a correction take root without needing his hand on it. Denise waited outside in her car, and when Tanya stepped into the evening air, she felt Alberta with her in the ordinary way grief sometimes stays close to love. Not as a ghost, as a standard. Miles reached for her hand. Tanya took it. She was still tired. She still had bills, shifts, groceries, and mornings to manage. But she was not walking out hidden anymore. Her care had a place now. Her name had room to stand. And the work she once carried alone had already begun moving forward in other hands.